The morning sun painted the walls of Buckingham Palace in a warm golden glow. It was just another Tuesday in London, and the famous palace was already buzzing with activity. Tourists from all corners of the world had started gathering behind the tall black railings, their excited chatter filling the air. Children pressed their faces against the metal bars, trying to get a better look at the palace where the royal family lived. The smell of fresh coffee drifted from nearby food trucks, mixing with the crisp autumn air. Street vendors called out, selling postcards and miniature Union Jack flags to eager visitors. Everyone seemed to be in a good mood, phones and cameras ready to capture the perfect shot of the legendary Queen's Guard. Standing perfectly still at his post was one of these famous guards. His bright red tunic was spotless, every button polished to perfection. The tall black bearskin hat sat firmly on his head, making him look even more impressive than his already tall frame. In his hands, he held his rifle with the kind of precision that only comes from years of military training. Tourists loved taking pictures with these guards. They would pose next to them, make funny faces, and even try to make them laugh or move. But the guard remained as still as a statue, staring straight ahead with unwavering focus. His breathing was so controlled that you could barely see his chest moving. This wasn't just for show. These men were real soldiers, trained to protect the royal family and the palace. The crowd grew larger as the morning went on. Families with young children pointed excitedly at the guard, explaining to their little ones about the important job he was doing. Teenage tourists took selfies, trying to get the perfect angle with the palace in the background. Elderly couples shared stories about their previous visits to London, remembering how the guards looked exactly the same decades ago. What most people didn't realize was how much training went into becoming one of these guards. Behind that ceremonial uniform was a highly skilled soldier who had spent months preparing for this role. They had to learn to stand perfectly still for hours, no matter what happened around them. Rain, wind, curious tourists, or even people trying to distract them. Nothing could break their concentration. The guard had been standing at his post since early morning. His feet were planted firmly on the ground, his grip on the rifle steady and sure. He had learned to ignore the constant noise of the crowd, the clicking of cameras, and the occasional tourist who got a little too close. His eyes remained focused, straight ahead, scanning for any real threats while maintaining that famous stoic expression. Security cameras positioned around the palace grounds quietly recorded everything. Palace security officers, dressed in plain clothes, moved through the crowd like invisible guardians. They looked like regular tourists, but their trained eyes were constantly watching for anything unusual. The safety of the royal family and the thousands of daily visitors was their top priority. The morning routine was familiar and comforting. Tour guides led groups of visitors, sharing fascinating stories about the palace's history and the traditions of the Queen's Guard. Children gasped in wonder when they learned that the guards couldn't move or speak while on duty, no matter what happened. Parents smiled as their kids tried to copy the guard's serious expression. Street performers added to the lively atmosphere. A man played violin near the palace gates while a woman painted portraits of tourists with the palace in the background. The whole area felt like a celebration of British culture and tradition. Everyone seemed happy to be there, soaking in the history and grandeur of one of the world's most famous buildings. The guard's partner stood at another post nearby, equally still and focused. They had trained together for months, learning to work as a team even when they couldn't communicate directly. Trust was everything in their job. They knew they could count on each other, no matter what situation might arise. As tourists continued to arrive, the energy around the palace grew. More exciting, school groups on field trips gathered in organized lines, their teachers explaining the importance of what they were seeing. International visitors practiced English phrases they had learned, eager to share their experience with friends back home. Local Londoners who had seen this scene countless times still paused to appreciate the impressive display. The guard had no way of knowing that this peaceful morning would soon turn into something completely different. In his training, he had prepared for various scenarios, but what was about to happen would test every skill he had learned. The calm, predictable routine that tourists loved so much was about to be shattered in a way that nobody could have imagined. The crowd continued to grow, and the atmosphere remained cheerful and relaxed. Camera flashes sparkled like tiny fireworks as people captured memories they would treasure forever. Children laughed and played while their parents admired the magnificent architecture of the palace. Street vendors did steady business selling souvenirs to excited tourists. Everything seemed perfect and normal, just another beautiful day at one of London's most beloved landmarks. The guard continued his duty with the same dedication and professionalism that had made the Queen's Guard famous worldwide. Little did anyone know that within minutes, this peaceful scene would transform into a moment that would be talked about for years to come. Among the happy crowd of tourists, one person stood out for all the wrong reasons. A man in his early 30s moved through the group in an odd way that made people step aside. His clothes were wrinkled and dirty, like he had been sleeping rough for several nights. His hair was messy, and his eyes had a wild, unfocused look that made nearby visitors feel uncomfortable. The man stumbled slightly as he walked, bumping into a family taking photos. The father politely moved his children away, sensing something wasn't quite right. The stranger mumbled something under his breath, but his words were unclear and jumbled. Some tourists thought he might be drunk, while others wondered if he needed medical help. Security cameras positioned around the palace began tracking his movements automatically. The advanced system was designed to flag unusual behavior, and this man's erratic walking pattern had triggered its attention. In the control room, a security officer noticed the alerts but hadn't yet determined if this was a serious threat or just someone who had too much to drink. The man's behavior became more concerning as he pushed through the crowd. He wasn't looking at the palace or the guards like everyone else. Instead, he seemed focused on something specific, his gaze locked in one direction. A group of teenagers moved away from him quickly when they saw the intense expression on his face. Their instincts told them to keep their distance. Palace security officers dressed in plain clothes started moving closer to monitor the situation. They looked like regular tourists, complete with cameras and guidebooks, but their trained eyes never left the suspicious individual. Years of experience had taught them to recognize when someone might cause trouble, and all their warning signals were going off. The man continued his unsteady journey toward where the Queen's Guard stood at attention. His movements became more determined, like he had finally decided on a course of action. Tourists near him began to feel genuinely worried. A mother pulled her young daughter closer, while an elderly couple decided to move to a different viewing spot entirely. What nobody realized was that this man had been planning something for days. He had mental health issues that hadn't been properly treated, and his condition had gotten worse recently. In his confused state of mind, he had developed an obsession with the palace guards and their weapons. He believed he needed to prove something, though his thoughts were too scrambled to make any real sense. The Queen's Guard remained perfectly still, unaware that he was becoming the focus of someone's dangerous attention. His training had prepared him to ignore distractions and maintain his position no matter what happened around him. Even if he had noticed the man approaching, protocol required him to stay at his post unless there was a clear and immediate threat. More tourists began to notice the strange behavior. A tour guide quietly radioed for assistance while continuing to speak to her group about palace history. She had been doing these tours for over 10 years and had learned to spot potential problems. Before they escalated, something about this man's behavior set off every alarm bell in her experienced mind. The suspicious individual was now less than 20 feet from the guard's position. His breathing had become heavier, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. His hands kept opening and closing into fists like he was preparing himself for something physical. The people around him could sense the tension building, even though they didn't understand what was happening. A family from Canada decided to leave the area entirely. The father had served in the military years ago, and his training helped him recognize signs of someone who might become violent. He quietly guided his wife and children toward the palace gates, not wanting to alarm them but trusting his instincts to get them away from potential danger. Security personnel were now actively converging on the area, but they had to be careful, not to cause panic among the hundreds of innocent tourists. Their job was to handle threats quietly and professionally, without turning a peaceful morning into a scary situation for families and children. They communicated through hidden earpieces, coordinating their response. The man's pace quickened as he got closer to the guard. His focus had narrowed to a single point, and everything else around him seemed to fade away. In his disturbed mental state, he had convinced himself that he needed to take action. The rational part of his mind that might have stopped him was no longer in control. Other tourists started backing away instinctively. They couldn't explain why, but something felt wrong about the whole situation. Children sensed their parents' tension and began asking questions, but adults weren't sure how to answer. The cheerful atmosphere that had filled the morning was slowly being replaced by an undercurrent of worry. The Queen's Guard maintained his professional stance, following years of training that had taught him to remain focused on his duty. His grip on his rifle was firm and correct, just as it had been every day for months. He had no idea that his weapon had become the center of someone's dangerous obsession, or that his morning routine was about to be violently interrupted. Palace. Security was now fully aware of the potential threat. Officers positioned themselves strategically around the area, ready to respond instantly if the situation escalated. They had dealt with disturbed individuals before, but each case was different and unpredictable. Their priority was protecting both the guard and the innocent tourist who had no idea what was developing. The man was now just steps away from the guard's position. His movements had become more agitated, and the last few tourists in his path quickly moved aside. The peaceful morning that had started with such promise was about to explode into chaos. Everything that happened next would unfold in seconds, but those seconds would be remembered and talked about for years to come. The stage was set for a confrontation that nobody had seen coming. In just moments, this ordinary Tuesday morning at Buckingham Palace would become extraordinary for all the wrong reasons. The calm before the storm was ending, and the storm itself was about to begin. Without any warning, the man suddenly exploded into action. In one desperate movement, he lunged forward with both hands reaching toward the Queen's Guard's rifle. The attack was so sudden and unexpected that for a split second, everyone froze, in shock. The peaceful morning atmosphere shattered like glass as screams erupted from the crowd of tourists. The guard's training kicked in instantly. Despite being caught off guard by the speed of the attack, years of military preparation took over his actions. In one smooth motion, he stepped back on his left foot while pivoting his body to protect his weapon. His grip on the rifle tightened, and his stance shifted from ceremonial to defensive in the blink of an eye. The attacker's hands grasped desperately at the military weapon, his fingers trying to find a grip on the metal barrel. His face was twisted with determination, and something that looked almost like rage. Saliva flew from his mouth as he grunted with effort, using all his strength to try to wrestle the rifle away from the trained soldier. Tourists who had been peacefully taking photos just seconds before now screamed and ran in all directions. Parents grabbed their children and rushed toward the palace gates, not knowing if this was part of a larger attack. An elderly woman fell down in the panic, but other tourists quickly helped her to her feet and guided her to safety. The Queen's Guard followed his training exactly as he had been taught. Instead of panicking or getting angry, he remained calm and professional. He called out the standard warning that all guards are taught to give: stand back from the Queen's Guard. His voice was loud and clear, cutting through the chaos and confusion around them. But the attacker wasn't listening to any warnings. His mental state made it impossible for him to think clearly or respond to reason. He continued to grab and pull at the rifle, his movements becoming more frantic and desperate. Sweat poured down his face as he used every ounce of strength he had, but the guard's training and physical conditioning were far superior. Cell phones appeared everywhere as tourists began recording the incredible scene. The footage would later be shared millions of times across social media, but in that moment, people were just trying to capture something they couldn't believe was really happening. Some filmed while backing away, others crouched behind barriers to get a better angle. The struggle lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours to everyone watching. The guard maintained perfect control of his weapon while assessing the threat level of his attacker. His training had taught him to use minimum necessary force, and he could see that this was likely someone with mental health issues rather than a trained terrorist. Security cameras captured every angle of the confrontation. The palace's advanced surveillance system automatically flagged the incident as a priority emergency, sending alerts to multiple agencies simultaneously. Within seconds, the footage was being reviewed by security experts who needed to determine if this was an isolated incident or part of a coordinated attack. The attacker's desperation grew as he realized he couldn't overpower the guard. His movements became wilder and less coordinated, but also more dangerous because of their unpredictability. The guard had to constantly adjust his defensive position to maintain control of both his weapon and the situation. Other tourists who had initially run away began to realize that this was an isolated incident involving just one disturbed individual. Some stopped running and turned back to watch, though they kept a safe distance. The human curiosity that makes people slow down to look at car accidents was taking over their fear. A tour guide who had been leading a group of visitors immediately began herding them toward the nearest exit. Her years of experience handling tourist groups kicked in as she calmly but firmly directed people away from the danger. She spoke in multiple languages, trying to help confused international visitors understand what was happening. The Queen's Guard's partner at a nearby post had also noticed the commotion and was following his own training protocols. While he couldn't abandon his position, he was ready to assist if the situation escalated further. His eyes constantly moved between his own area of responsibility and the struggle happening just meters away. Palace security officers were now running toward the scene from multiple directions. Their plainclothes disguises were abandoned as they pulled out radios and began coordinating their response. Years of training for exactly this type of scenario were about to be put to the test in real-world conditions. The attacker made one final, desperate attempt to gain control of the weapon. He threw his entire body weight forward, trying to knock the guard off balance. But the soldier's stance was perfect, his center of gravity low and stable. The man's amateur attack technique was no match for professional military training. The crowd had now formed a rough circle around the struggle, with everyone keeping a respectful but curious distance. Some people were still filming, while others just stood in amazement at what they were witnessing. Children asked their parents what was happening, but most adults were too shocked to give coherent answers. Street vendors abandoned their posts to see what was causing all the commotion. The violin player stopped his music mid-song, his bow hanging in the air as he stared at the unprecedented scene. Even local Londoners who thought they had seen everything stopped to watch this extraordinary moment. The Queen's Guard remained completely professional throughout the entire encounter. Despite being physically attacked and having someone try to steal his weapon, he never lost his temper or used more force than necessary. His training had prepared him for this exact scenario, and he was executing his response perfectly. The attacker's strength was beginning to fade as the adrenaline rush that had fueled his initial assault started to wear off. His grip on the rifle became weaker, and his movements less coordinated. The guard could sense that the immediate phase of the threat was coming to an end, but he remained vigilant for any sudden changes. What had started as a peaceful Tuesday morning had exploded into chaos and confusion. But even in the middle of this unprecedented attack, the professionalism and training of the Queen's Guard was shining through. The situation was far from over, but the guard had successfully prevented his weapon from being taken. Now he just had to wait for backup to arrive. Within seconds of the attack beginning, the sound of heavy boots hitting pavement echoed across the palace grounds. Additional Queen's Guards appeared from multiple directions, their ceremonial pace completely abandoned in favor of swift, tactical movement. These weren't just ceremonial soldiers, they were combat-trained professionals responding to a real threat against one of their own. The transformation was incredible to witness. These men, who had been standing like statues just moments before, were now moving with the precision and speed of an elite military unit. Their bright red uniforms and tall bearskin hats might have looked ceremonial, but their movements were pure military efficiency. Years of training had prepared them for exactly this moment. Palace security officers arrived at almost exactly the same time, their radios crackling with urgent communications in coded language. They had been moving toward the scene from the moment their surveillance systems detected the disturbance. Their response time was measured in seconds, not minutes, showing just how seriously palace security took any threat to their personnel. The original guard who had been attacked maintained perfect control of his weapon throughout the entire encounter. Even while being physically assaulted, he had never wavered in his grip on the rifle or his professional composure. Now, with backup arriving, he could focus on safely restraining the attacker without having to worry about protecting his weapon, alone. The coordination between the guards was flawless. Without saying a word, they moved into positions that had been drilled into them through countless hours of training. One guard secured the weapon side, another controlled the attacker's arms, while a third positioned himself to prevent any escape attempt. It was like watching a perfectly choreographed dance, except this was deadly serious. The attacker found himself completely overwhelmed in a matter of seconds. What had started as a one-on-one struggle was now 4 highly trained soldiers working together to subdue him. His desperate attempts to fight back were useless against their coordinated response. The difference between an untrained, disturbed individual and professional military personnel became crystal clear. Tourists watched in absolute amazement as the takedown unfolded before their eyes. Many had never seen real military precision in action, and the speed and efficiency of the guards' response was breathtaking. Cell phone cameras captured every second, but even high-definition video couldn't fully convey the intensity and professionalism of what was happening. The guards used exactly the right amount of force, enough to completely control the situation, but not enough to cause unnecessary injury. Their training had taught them to subdue threats while minimizing harm whenever possible. This wasn't about revenge or anger. It was about professional execution of their duty to protect the palace and its visitors. Radio chatter filled the air as security coordinators managed the response from their control room. Multiple agencies were being notified simultaneously. Palace security, Metropolitan Police, and anti-terrorism units all needed to know what was happening. The incident was being treated with the utmost seriousness until they could confirm it was an isolated event. The attacker's resistance crumbled quickly under the professional response. Within 30 seconds of backup arriving, he was face down on the ground with his hands secured behind his back. His earlier desperation had been replaced by the reality that his attack had failed completely. The Queen's guards had done their job exactly as they were trained to do. Crowd control became the next priority as hundreds of tourists pressed closer to see what was happening. Additional security personnel appeared to manage the growing crowd of onlookers. They needed to maintain a safe perimeter while allowing the incident to be resolved without creating panic or trampling risks among the excited visitors. A security supervisor arrived and immediately began assessing the situation. His experienced eyes took in the scene quickly. One subdued attacker, no apparent weapons beyond the failed attempt to steal the rifle, and no signs of additional threats. His preliminary assessment suggested this was an isolated incident rather than part of a coordinated attack. The original guard who had been attacked was asked if he needed medical attention. Despite having been physically assaulted, he showed no signs of injury and declined any medical evaluation. His training and physical conditioning had prepared him well for the encounter. His main concern was ensuring his weapon was secure and accounted for. Medical personnel arrived as a precaution, both for the subdued attacker and to be available if anyone in the crowd had been injured during the panic. The man who had attempted the attack was showing signs of being under the influence of drugs or alcohol, and his mental state clearly needed professional evaluation. The coordination between different security forces was impressive to observe. Palace guards, security officers, and arriving police personnel worked together seamlessly. Years of joint training and clear protocols meant that everyone knew their role and how to work with the other agencies involved in the response. Tourists began to realize that the immediate danger was over, and many started moving closer again to get better photos and videos. Security personnel had to work constantly to maintain appropriate distances while allowing people to witness this historic moment. The balance between public interest and security requirements was delicate but manageable. The efficiency of the entire response sent a clear message to anyone watching. The Queen's Guard weren't just ceremonial figures standing around for tourists to photograph. They were highly trained, professional soldiers capable of handling real threats with speed, precision, and appropriate force. Their reputation for excellence had been earned through exactly this kind of performance. Within minutes of the attack beginning, the situation was completely under control. The attacker was secured, the weapon was safe, no one had been seriously injured, and normal operations could begin to resume. The training, preparation, and professionalism of the Queen's Guard had been tested under real-world conditions, and they had passed with flying colors. The entire incident would be analyzed and reviewed multiple times to identify any lessons that could improve future responses. But even in the immediate aftermath, it was clear that the system had worked exactly as designed. The combination of individual training, team coordination, and institutional preparation had prevented what could have been a much more serious situation. As the immediate crisis passed, the full magnitude of what had just happened began to sink in for everyone involved. This wasn't something that happened every day, even at one of the world's most secure locations. The professional response of the Queen's Guard had turned a potentially dangerous situation into a demonstration of military excellence. Metropolitan police vehicles arrived within minutes, their sirens echoing off the palace walls as they pulled up to the scene. Officers immediately took custody of the subdued attacker, following established protocols for incidents involving royal properties. The man was loaded into a police van, where he would be taken for medical evaluation and questioning to determine exactly what had motivated his dangerous actions. Initial police investigations quickly revealed important details about the attacker's background. He was a local resident with a documented history of mental health struggles and substance abuse problems. Court records showed previous arrests for disorderly conduct and minor theft, but nothing that had indicated he might attempt something as serious as attacking a royal guard. His family later confirmed that his condition had worsened recently, and they had been trying to get him help. The incident sparked immediate reviews of palace security protocols at the highest levels of government. While the response had been flawless, security experts wanted to understand how someone in such an obviously disturbed state had managed to get so close to an armed guard without being intercepted earlier. Questions were raised about screening procedures for tourists and whether additional barriers might be necessary. News of the attack spread across social media within minutes, with multiple videos of the incident going viral before official statements could be prepared. The footage showed clearly that the Queen's Guard had handled the situation with remarkable professionalism, but it also raised concerns about security vulnerabilities that hadn't been fully appreciated before this incident occurred. Government officials held emergency meetings to discuss whether this represented a new type of threat that required changes to security procedures. The fact that the attacker had specifically targeted the guard's weapon suggested a level of planning that was concerning. Even if his mental state had made his execution of the plan ineffective, they needed to consider whether other disturbed individuals might attempt similar attacks. The Queen's Guard, who had been attacked, became the subject of widespread praise for his restraint and professionalism. Military analysts noted that his response had been textbook perfect. He had protected his weapon, called for backup, and subdued the threat without using excessive force. His actions were being studied as an example of how training and discipline could prevent a bad situation from becoming much worse. International media picked up the story within hours, with news outlets around the world broadcasting the dramatic footage. The incident became a talking point about both the effectiveness of royal security and the broader issues of mental health support in modern society. The video was viewed millions of times, making it one of the most widely seen security incidents in recent memory. Palace officials released a carefully worded statement praising the professionalism of their security personnel while expressing concern for the mental health issues that had led to the attack. They emphasized that the Queen's Guard were highly trained soldiers who took their responsibilities seriously, and that public safety around royal properties remained their top priority. Security experts used the incident as a case study in threat assessment and response procedures. The fact that surveillance systems had identified the potential threat, but not quickly enough to prevent the initial contact, led to discussions about improving early warning capabilities. New protocols were developed for identifying and intercepting individuals showing signs of mental disturbance before they could get close to sensitive areas. The tourism industry around Buckingham Palace was briefly affected as visitors worried about safety. However, the professional response of the guards actually had the opposite effect that many expected. Tourist numbers increased as people wanted to see the famous guards who had handled the situation so expertly. Many visitors expressed that they felt safer knowing how well-trained and prepared the security personnel were. Mental health advocates used the incident to highlight the need for better support systems for people struggling with psychological issues. They pointed out that the attacker's family had been trying to get him help, but the system had failed to provide adequate intervention before his condition led to criminal behavior. The incident became part of broader discussions about community mental health resources. The video footage was analyzed frame by security professionals worldwide. Every aspect of the guards' response was studied to understand what had worked well and what might be improved in future training. The incident became a valuable teaching tool for military and security forces around the globe, showing real-world application of defensive techniques. Legal proceedings against the attacker moved forward through the court system, with mental health evaluations playing a central role in determining appropriate charges and sentencing. The case raised complex questions about criminal responsibility when mental illness was a significant factor. Ultimately, the focus shifted toward getting the individual proper treatment rather than purely punitive measures. The incident led to new training scenarios being added to Queen's Guard preparation programs. While guards had always trained for various types of threats, this specific situation, a mentally disturbed individual attempting to grab their weapon, became a standard exercise. The real-world experience provided invaluable insights that improved the training for future guards. Tourism operations around the palace were enhanced with additional safety briefings for visitors. Tour guides were trained to better identify potentially disturbed individuals and report concerns before situations could escalate. The goal was to maintain the open, welcoming atmosphere that tourists loved, while being more proactive about identifying potential problems. Years later, the incident is still remembered as a defining moment that demonstrated the true professionalism of the Queen's Guard. What could have been a tragic situation was resolved through excellent training, quick thinking, and appropriate use of force. The guards involved became examples of military excellence, and their response continues to be studied and admired by security professionals worldwide. The lasting impact of the incident went far beyond the immediate participants. It changed how people thought about ceremonial guards, showing that behind the traditional uniforms and tourist-friendly ceremonies were serious military professionals ready to handle real threats. The Queen's Guard had proven that they were much more than just a colorful tradition. They were a highly effective security force, worthy of the trust placed in them. The incident also served as a reminder that even in the most secure and controlled environments, unexpected threats can emerge from the most unlikely sources. The combination of mental illness, substance abuse, and easy access to high-profile targets created a dangerous situation that could have had much worse consequences. Without proper preparation and professional response,